It is 10 years now since the British people, in defiance of almost every institution that claimed authority over their political life, voted to leave the European Union. A decade is a respectable interval for reflection. It is long enough for the dust of the original controversy to settle, long enough for the warnings of catastrophe to be tested against reality, and long enough, one might think, for the European Union to have confronted the structural question that the British vote forced into the open. Yet, on the anniversary of that referendum, the most striking thing about Europe's migration debate is not what has changed, but what has not. In Brussels, the official disposition remains what it has always been, that Brexit was an aberration, an unfortunate spasm of British insularity, a tantrum unworthy of serious institutional reflection. The fact that immigration was, by every measure of opinion polling and post-vote analysis, the single most decisive issue in the referendum is treated, when it is acknowledged at all, as something to be deplored rather than something to be examined. This is a pity, because beneath the noise of the campaign, beneath the buses and the warnings and the posters, there was a serious question being asked. It was a question about how a continent of democracies, each accountable to its own electorate, could share an open internal space when individual member states retained the unilateral power to decide who entered that space from outside. A question, in other words, about the architecture of European borders and about the relationship between democratic consent and shared territory. Few questions in political life are more fundamental. None has been more studiously avoided. 10 years on, the question remains. The institutions of the European Union have made marginal adjustments. The political pressure has, if anything, intensified, and the design flaw that Britain identified, and which Britain ultimately chose to escape rather than to repair, has reappeared with almost theatrical timing in the form of a Spanish government decree, a Hungarian election result, and a piece of legislation due to take effect in June of this year, whose name announces an ambition its substance struggles to match. What follows is not a brief for or against the European Union. It is a brief for clarity. The argument is simply that a question of constitutional weight cannot remain indefinitely unanswered by repeating with each new crisis that it does not exist. The British referendum was, among other things, a request that the question be acknowledged. It is the central thesis of this essay that the request remains unmet, and that the cost of leaving it unmet is being paid in installments by every European democracy, including those whose governments most loudly insist that the bill has been settled. To understand what is happening now, one must return briefly to what happened then. In the late summer of 2015, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel took a decision that altered the political weather of an entire continent. Faced with rising flows of asylum seekers from the Syrian civil war and other conflicts, she suspended the Dublin regulation, the EU mechanism that normally required asylum claims to be processed in the first member state an applicant entered, and committed Germany to an open-handed policy summed up in 3 words: wir schaffen das. We can manage this. It is sometimes forgotten how much was packed into those 3 words. Merkel was not merely declaring a domestic policy. She was, by virtue of Germany's role as the largest and most powerful state in the Schengen area, making a decision on behalf of every government with which Germany shared an open internal border. She was, in effect, opening a door whose hinges she did not herself own. What followed is well documented. Over 1 million people arrived in Germany in that single year. Hundreds of thousands more moved across the Balkans, through Austria and Hungary, into France and elsewhere. The images that accompanied this movement, the Keleti railway station in Budapest, the beaches of Lesbos, the Macedonian frontier, were broadcast nightly into the living rooms of an entire continent, including British ones, by news organisations that were on the whole sympathetic to the migrants and uncritical of the policy that had drawn them. To watch them in Britain, even from the safe distance of an island that had never joined Schengen, was to watch a great experiment in continental management visibly running ahead of the continent's capacity to manage it. We are told, even now, that this was a moment of European compassion. It was certainly a moment of German compassion. Whether it was European is more debatable, since the populations of Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Denmark, Sweden, and eventually France and Germany itself drew rather different lessons from what they were seeing. The argument that Merkel made, that a wealthy continent of 500 million souls had a moral duty to receive those fleeing war, was a serious one, made in good faith, and it deserved a serious answer. What it did not deserve, and what it did not get, was the easy assumption that the rest of Europe had already agreed. What Merkel had unintentionally demonstrated was a structural truth that the European Union had spent decades pretending to ignore. In a borderless internal space, one country's admission decision becomes every country's admission. There is no firewall, there is no waiting room. There is only the open continent, and the consequences of any major migration decision distribute themselves across that continent whether the other governments consent or not. This was not in itself a discovery, it was always inherent in the design. But what makes inconvenient truths inconvenient is the moment one is forced to look at them. And in 2015, Europe was forced to look. The lesson, however, was rapidly subordinated to a more comforting interpretation. The crisis, the official narrative quickly settled, had been caused not by the policy choice itself, but by the failure of certain unhelpful Eastern member states, Hungary above all, to display the requisite solidarity. The question was not whether the original decision had been wise. The question was why the others had not joined in. Hungary's administration, for instance, became a prominent critic of the prevailing European consensus on migration management. Regardless of one's broader view of their record, their specific objection regarding the right of national electorates to decide on such matters has remained a persistent part of the institutional debate. The eventual inclusion of flexible solidarity in the new Pact serves as a quiet recognition of the need to balance regional coordination with national consent. One can think what one likes of Orbán, and there is much in his subsequent record that even his admirers find difficult. But on this particular point, his objection has not been overturned by events. That is a narrow vindication on a narrow point, but it is a vindication. Before going further, it is worth pausing to clarify two terms that the British press, the British public, and indeed a fair number of British politicians persistently conflated in the years before and after the referendum. Freedom of movement and Schengen are related, but they are not the same thing. Freedom of movement is a core treaty right of the European Union. It allows citizens of any member state to live, work, study, and settle in any other, on broadly equal terms with the host country's own nationals. It is one of the four foundational freedoms of the single market, alongside the free movement of goods, services, and capital, and it has shaped the demography of Europe more profoundly than almost any other policy in living memory. Schengen is something else. A separate agreement named after a small village in Luxembourg that abolishes routine internal border controls between its 29 participating countries. Most EU members are part of Schengen, but not all. Conversely, Schengen extends to several non-EU states such as Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. Within the zone, in the absence of a declared emergency, one may pass from Lisbon to the Polish-Belarusian border without showing a passport. Outside it, the external Schengen frontier is supposed to be, and is on paper, treated as a single perimeter, governed by common rules and policed in common. Britain never joined Schengen. It retained, throughout its EU membership, the right to check passports at Dover and Heathrow and every other point of entry. This is a point that ought to have made the British position on the 2015 crisis less fevered than it became, and in a purely legal sense it did. Britain could not be compelled to accept anyone Germany had admitted. What Britain could not escape, however, was the political reality of sharing a continent with 26 other governments whose admission decisions reshaped the demographic landscape they all inhabited. No channel could insulate British public opinion from images of a continental crisis. No opt-out could prevent the perception, fair or not, that the European project as a whole had lost control of its external frontier. The legal exemption was real, the psychological exposure was unavoidable. It was, in the end, this gap between technical immunity and shared atmosphere that did so much of the work in the referendum campaign. British Euroscepticism did not begin in 2015. It had its roots in arguments far older about the euro, about the European Court of Justice, about what was unflatteringly called the democratic deficit, about the long unfinished question of whether the United Kingdom regarded itself as a European nation in the continental sense or something different. These were arguments of long standing, prosecuted by serious people on both sides over decades. But what 2015 supplied was something the abstract Eurosceptic case had previously lacked: a visceral, televised, daily example of what loss of control looked like. Nigel Farage's Breaking Point poster, unveiled in the final week of the campaign and utilising imagery intended to highlight the scale of movement across borders, was a subject of intense national debate. The visual approach was heavily scrutinised and debated across the political spectrum. The official Vote Leave campaign distanced itself from the poster on the day of its launch. Boris Johnson said publicly that it was not our campaign and not my politics. And Michael Gove, also a senior figure within Vote Leave, said on national television that he had shuddered when he saw it. Condemnation was not confined to one side, but its political effect was undeniable. And to attribute that effect entirely to the supposed credulity of the British public would be to evade the more uncomfortable possibility that the poster registered, because the underlying intuition it summoned, that the question of who came to Europe had ceased, in any meaningful sense, to be a question over which their own elected representatives exercised effective authority, was already widely held. The poster offered a picture. The voters supplied the meaning. The picture was rightly criticised. The meaning, which was about democratic agency rather than about migrants themselves, remains the more interesting question, and it has not been answered. The referendum was, of course, decided on many things at once. It was decided on sovereignty in the abstract sense, on regulation, on the contributions to the EU budget, on a long accumulated frustration with what the late Sir Roger Scruton, in another context, called the substitution of an unaccountable elsewhere for an accountable somewhere. But within that cluster of complaints, immigration occupied a privileged position. It was the issue on which the gap between what voters wanted and what their political class was prepared to deliver had grown widest and the most visible. The migration crisis did not invent the Brexit vote. It made it possible. And here it is worth saying something that the official narrative of the last decade has resisted strenuously, that the British vote was not, in its essential character, a rejection of foreigners. It was a rejection of a particular institutional arrangement under which the decision of who entered Europe, and therefore who might in time become a neighbour, a colleague, a fellow citizen, had passed out of the hands of any government that British voters could remove. One may regard that arrangement as the price of a noble project. One may regard it as the price of an excessive one. What one cannot reasonably do is pretend that the British vote was unreasoning, or that the question it raised has been answered. In the decade since, the European Union has not been idle. To say that it has not addressed the underlying question is not to say that it has done nothing. It has done a great deal, most of it technical, much of it useful at the margins, and almost none of it touching the constitutional problem that 2015 exposed. Frontex, the EU's border and coast guard agency, has been expanded substantially. Its standing corps has grown, its budget has multiplied. Its mandate has been extended into matters of return and migration management that would have been thought firmly national a generation ago. Bulgaria, whose long border with Turkey forms one of the more sensitive sections of the external Schengen frontier, has received material support. Fencing, surveillance towers, drone operations, the apparatus of a hardening edge. Greece and Italy, the frontline states of the Mediterranean, have been steadily reinforced. The political class in Brussels can point to all this and say, with some justice, that the visible disorder of 2015 has not been allowed to recur. And then there is the Pact. The new Pact on Migration and Asylum, formally adopted by the Council in May 2024, is set to enter into application on the 12th of June this year. It is a substantial piece of legislation, 10 interlocking legal acts, by the Council's own description, that touches on screening at the external border, on the procedures governing asylum claims, on the rules of responsibility between member states, on detention and return, and on what is now called solidarity between countries that bear the brunt of arrivals and countries that do not. It is, in administrative terms, a serious attempt at coherence. It is also, in political terms, an instructive document, not least for what it conspicuously does not do. Under the Pact, frontline states facing migratory pressure no longer face mandatory relocation of migrants to other member states. Instead, the so-called solidarity mechanism has been recast as a flexible one. A country that wishes not to host relocated asylum seekers may instead make a financial contribution or provide operational support or assist with returns. The reference figures for 2026 are roughly 21,000 relocations or alternative measures, or 420 million euros in financial contributions. These are not negligible numbers. They are also, by the standards of the original ambition of relocation across the Union, modest ones. They represent, more candidly than any official document is permitted to admit, the political collapse of the original idea that the entire continent could be compelled to share in proportionate quotas in the consequences of any one country's admission. In other words, the Pact accepts at the level of practice what Brussels has refused to accept at the level of principle, that no European government can be forced against the wishes of its own electorate to take in people it has not chosen to take in. The flexibility that has been built into the new arrangement is, in this sense, a quiet vindication of the very Hungarian position that the European mainstream spent the better part of a decade denouncing. That vindication is not advertised, but it is there in the text. This, however, is only half of the asymmetry. The Pact has tools, escalating financial penalties, infringement procedures, the whole panoply of EU coercion, to punish a member state that refuses to participate in solidarity. It has no comparable tools to restrain a member state whose generous admission policies impose burdens on its neighbours. The architecture of correction runs in one direction only. One may criticise reluctance. One may not, it appears, criticise enthusiasm. If one wished to design a case study illustrating precisely the structural problem that 2015 exposed and that the Pact has not solved, one could hardly improve on what is presently unfolding in Spain. In late January of this year, the Spanish cabinet of Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez approved by royal decree an extraordinary regularisation programme for some 500,000 undocumented migrants. The application window opened in mid-April. It closes at the end of June. Any foreign national without serious criminal record who can demonstrate residence in Spain before the 31st of December 2025 and continuous presence for at least 5 months may apply. The reward is a 1-year residence and work permit, renewable for 4 further years with a pathway eventually to citizenship. The Spanish government's defence of the measure is, on its own terms, internally coherent. Spain has an ageing society. It has labour shortages in agriculture, in elder care, in tourism, in construction. Its informal economy contains hundreds of thousands of people already working but invisible to the tax system. To regularise them is, the government argues, to bring them into social security contributions, to lift them out of dependence on the grey economy, and to address, through immigration rather than fertility, a demographic problem that no European country has yet solved by other means. Sánchez has called the measure a moral imperative and an economic necessity. His ministers have noted that immigrants contribute roughly 1/10 of Spanish GDP. This is not nothing, and yet. The decision was taken by a single national government. The Council was not consulted. The Commission was not consulted. The other 26 member states were not consulted. The European Commissioner for Internal Affairs and Migration, when asked, declined to offer judgment, observing that the matter was a national competence. Officials in Brussels, speaking anonymously to journalists, were rather less restrained, describing the move as not in line with the European Union's spirit on migration. What they could not quite say, because the architecture of the Union does not permit it to be said, is that a single member state has just exercised a power whose consequences will be borne, in some measure, by every other member of the Schengen area. For under Schengen, a regularised migrant with a Spanish residence permit acquires the right of free travel across the zone for 90 days in every 180. After 5 years, he may, under existing EU long-term residence rules, qualify for more permanent rights of movement and residence elsewhere in the Union. The Spanish decision will produce, by Spanish initiative and on the Spanish timetable, 500,000 persons whose freedom of movement begins in Madrid but does not end there. Whether they actually move is, of course, an empirical question. The question of who decided that they could is not. The response from elsewhere has been instructive. In France, Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella of the Rassemblement National denounced the measure within days, framing it as a pull factor that would generate onward movement into French territory. Similar warnings came from politicians in Germany, in Italy, and the Netherlands. These warnings were dismissed in much of the international press as predictable noises from the populist right, which they were, and as factually exaggerated, which they may also have been. What was less commented upon was that the criticism was not really about the merits of Spanish migration policy at all. It was about the fact that Spanish migration policy had now become French migration policy, and German and Italian by simple operation of geography and treaty. This is the question Brexit raised, restated in 2026 with rather more elegance than in 2015. Then it was an emergency, now it is a deliberate policy. Then it was Berlin, now it is Madrid. The names change. The structure does not. A national government, accountable only to its own electorate, makes an admission or regularisation decision of continental scale, and the rest of the continent is informed afterwards. One is invited to admire the act or to denounce the act or to weigh its economic merits. One is not invited anywhere within the official machinery of the European Union to ask the constitutional question, which is whether a decision of this magnitude ought to be available as a purely unilateral national instrument to any member state at all. Brussels, predictably enough, is uncomfortable. The Commission convened a parliamentary debate in February explicitly titled Spain's Large-Scale Regularisation Policy and Its Impact on the Schengen Area and EU Migration Policy. But discomfort and remedy are not the same thing. There is no mechanism by which Spain may be required to internalise the cost it has externalised. There is no compensatory contribution. There is no temporary safeguard clause that affected neighbours may invoke. There is only the dialogue, the perpetual, productive, inconclusive European dialogue about a problem the institutions are constitutionally unable to solve. At this point, a defender of the Brussels position, or simply a careful reader unwilling to grant the argument too quickly, would be entitled to interrupt. The objection might run something like this. Is this not in the end an argument over nothing? Spain has acted within its sovereign competence. Other member states retain their own competence to act or not to act as they see fit. The very flexibility the essay elsewhere praises in the new Pact is the same flexibility that permits Spain its decision. Where precisely is the externality? And if the externality is real, why have the supposedly affected governments not, in fact, brought the matter before the European Court of Justice? It is a fair challenge and one that deserves a fair reply. The first part of the answer is that the question is, in some form, already being asked in Brussels itself, and not merely on the eccentric fringes of European opinion. When the matter was first put to Magnus Brunner, the European Commissioner for Internal Affairs and Migration, in early 2026, his on-the-record response was studiously neutral. The matter, he observed, was a national responsibility. That was a prudent thing to say. It was not, however, the end of the conversation. Off the record, Commission officials speaking to Euronews were less guarded. One described the Spanish measure as not in line with the European Union's spirit on migration. Another worried, more specifically, that a massive regularisation risks sending a different message compared to the one that the EU is currently communicating outside Europe to deter irregular migration. These are not the words of populist agitators. They are the private words of senior officials of the executive that the defender's own argument depends upon. If the externality were genuinely nothing, none of this would have been said. It was said because something had, in fact, been noticed. The second part of the answer is more substantive. The defender is correct that Spain has acted within its competence. That is precisely the point. The argument of this essay is not that Spain has broken the rules, it is that the rules, as currently constituted, permit decisions of continental consequence to be taken without continental consultation, and that this is itself the constitutional problem the European project, having grown so large and so consequential, can no longer responsibly defer. A regime in which everything is permitted within national competence and nothing required by continental procedure is a regime that systematically rewards unilateral action and systematically discourages the very solidarity that Brussels claims to want. One does not need to break the rules in order to expose their inadequacy. One needs only to use them. The third part of the answer concerns the court. The European Court of Justice is, on its own terms, an excellent forum for the resolution of disputes between member states over the interpretation of treaty law. It is a poor forum for the management of political externalities. The kind of remedy this essay will sketch in due course, prior notification, impact assessment, financial compensation, temporary safeguard clauses, is not the kind of remedy a court delivers. It is the kind of remedy that a treaty, properly negotiated, contains in advance. The absence of court action against Spain is therefore not evidence that no problem exists. It is evidence that the architecture as presently designed has no procedural channel through which the problem can be raised, examined and addressed in its proper political form. The defender may, of course, press the point further. He may say that the essay overstates the practical consequences of any single national decision, that Spanish regularisation will not, in fact, produce the onward movements certain French and German politicians have warned of, that the political class is right to dismiss such warnings as inflated. On the empirics, he may yet be proven right, and an honest essayist will admit it. But that is, in the end, a different argument. It is the argument over whether this particular externality is large or small. It is not the argument over whether the architecture has any mechanism at all for handling externalities of the kind. On that second question, which is the question this essay is actually about, the architecture remains silent. And the silence, 10 years after Brexit raised the question, is itself the news. Across the continent, in a country whose government was for years the principal foil of the European mainstream on precisely these questions, something has occurred that complicates the easy narrative on both sides. On the 12th of April this year, Hungarian voters delivered a landslide to Péter Magyar's Tisza party, a centre-right, broadly pro-European force that won a two-thirds supermajority and ended 16 years of government by Viktor Orbán's Fidesz. The story was greeted in Brussels with relief that bordered on euphoria. Ursula von der Leyen tweeted that Hungary has chosen Europe. Barack Obama, from rather further away, hailed it as a victory for democracy. The mood was unmistakable. At last, the awkward Eastern outlier had returned to the fold. Whatever one thinks of Orbán's broader record, and there is in that record a great deal that even sympathetic observers find difficult, from the treatment of independent media to the conduct of public procurement, the more interesting question is what the new government has not promised to undo. On migration, Tisza's published positions are conspicuously continuous with what came before. The party opposes mandatory relocation quotas. It supports the maintenance of strict border security protocols at Hungary's southern frontier. It has expressed scepticism about the EU's migration pact. Magyar's foreign policy, as the LSE's analysts have already noted, remains fundamentally conservative and focused on national sovereignty. On the very issue for which Orbán was most fiercely denounced, the new government has, in its essentials, simply taken over the position. This is not a coincidence. It is a recognition of political reality. Eurobarometer polling continues to find immigration consistently among the issues that European voters consider most pressing. A government that wished to remain in office in Central Europe, and not only in Central Europe, cannot now afford the kind of openness that was briefly fashionable in 2015. Tisza understands this. The European mainstream understands this. What both have arrived at, by routes that look very different and accomplish very similar destinations, is the same conclusion, that compulsory continental solidarity on migration cannot be made to work against the wishes of national electorates, and that the attempt to make it work cost the European project a great deal of legitimacy that it has not yet recovered. Orbán represents, in this narrow respect, one of the more unusual cases in modern European politics, a leader defeated comprehensively at home on the broad balance of his record, whose central critique of the EU's migration architecture has nonetheless been, in substance, absorbed by the institutions that defeated him. He has been turned out of office by his own electorate. having exhausted their patience on a variety of matters that had nothing to do with migration. Yet the position he championed on the question that brought him to international prominence has, in substance, prevailed in Brussels. The flexible solidarity mechanism in the new pact is, whatever else it is, an acknowledgement that compulsory relocation across borders could not survive the politics it generated. That acknowledgement is, in its way, a legacy. Whether the man whose career produced it would have wished to claim it is another question. He has it whether he wishes it or not. None of this excuses the rest of the Orban record, nor should it be used to do so. The argument here is narrower and worth stating precisely that the strongest critic of the EU's migration architecture has been defeated at home, while his critique of that architecture has been quietly absorbed into the architecture itself. This is not how the story was supposed to end. It is, however, how it has ended. Honest accounting requires that one say so. All of which brings us back to the design flaw, what an economist with the unflinching language of his profession would simply call the externality. An externality is a cost that arises from one party's decision but is borne by another. The classical illustrations come from shared resources and shared infrastructure. A fishing fleet that draws from a common lake faster than the lake can replenish leaves every other operator with a diminished catch. A haulage firm whose lorries wear down a road network used by all may capture the profit of cheap transport while the maintenance falls to the public purse. In each case, a decision taken by one actor distributes consequences across many, none of whom had a voice in the original choice. The remedy in any well-functioning system is to internalize the externality, to ensure by tax or regulation or some other means that the party imposing the adjustment cost is the party that bears, or at least pays for, that cost. The European Union has built, in Schengen, a borderless internal space without ever constructing a comparable mechanism for the field of migration. When a member state makes a major admission or regularisation decision, the budgetary consequences for the receiving state are visible and direct. Increased pressure on housing markets, on welfare systems, on schools, on policing and integration services. These are not abstract. They are documented in the annual budgets of every European interior ministry. What the architecture of Schengen does, however, is to spread those budgetary and administrative consequences in part to states that did not take the original decision and had no formal opportunity to influence it. When Germany acted in 2015, the secondary movements across the continent imposed measurable costs on Austria, Sweden, France and others. When Spain regularises 500,000 residents in 2026, the same dynamic will operate. More slowly perhaps, more diffusely, but operate it will. In each case, the initiating state captures the political credit, the moral satisfaction and, if the policy succeeds on its own terms, the long-run economic benefit. A measurable portion of the short-run adjustment falls elsewhere. The decision is national. The bill, at least in part, is continental. This is not a moral judgment on either Germany in 2015 or Spain in 2026. Reasonable people may regard the substantive policies of each as wise or unwise, generous or reckless, far-sighted or short-sighted. The argument is not about the substance of the policies. It is about the architecture under which they were taken. And that architecture, by leaving such decisions in national hands while ensuring that their consequences flow across all internal borders, generates a structural incentive towards exactly the kind of unilateral action that erodes mutual trust. It rewards the country that acts first. It penalizes the country that voices reservations afterwards. It produces repeatedly and predictably the kind of resentment that figures like Le Pen and Farage do not need to invent because the architecture produces it for them. The European Union, having recognized this problem in the form of complaints, has consistently misdiagnosed it as a failure of attitude. The official line, repeated patiently for a decade, is that the trouble lies with member states that refuse to display the requisite solidarity. The Pact solidarity mechanism is built on this premise: infringement proceedings, structural fund withholding, the discreet diplomatic disapproval of Commission officials. All of these are pointed at countries which fail to take their share. None is pointed at countries whose unilateral generosity creates the share in the first place. A symmetrical architecture would point in both directions. The European architecture points only in one. The asymmetry is not accidental. It expresses a particular vision of the project in which openness is always presumed virtuous and restraint always presumed suspect. But virtues, like vices, can be externalized onto unwilling neighbors. And when they are, neighborliness suffers. What would a serious response look like? It would begin by acknowledging the problem in its proper terms. It would treat large-scale admission decisions in a borderless area not as purely national affairs, but as decisions with continental consequences that demand continental procedures. It would not seek to abolish the national right to make such decisions. That would be both politically impossible and philosophically wrong, since immigration policy lies very near the core of what democratic self-government means. But it would seek to ensure that the costs of such decisions fell as far as possible where the decisions themselves were made. Several mechanisms suggest themselves. The first is procedural. Mandatory prior notification to the Council and to fellow member states of any large-scale regularisation programme, exceptional admission, or substantial change in asylum recognition rates. This would not give other governments a veto. It would simply give them notice and require the initiating government to defend its choice publicly to its neighbours before rather than after the policy takes effect. There is no good reason why a measure affecting 500,000 residents' permits should be announced by royal decree of a single state without so much as a courtesy briefing to those who will share the consequences. The second is analytic, independent impact assessments of likely onward movement, welfare exposure, housing and labour market effects, and security implications conducted by a body answerable to the Union rather than to any single member state. Such assessments would not, of themselves, prevent national governments from acting. They would, however, provide a documentary basis on which affected neighbours could press their concerns. The absence of such assessments at present means that arguments about consequences are conducted in the dark, with each side citing whichever figures it can find. That is not how serious continental governance ought to operate. The third is corrective, temporary safeguard clauses of the kind already familiar in other areas of EU law that would allow affected member states to reimpose limited internal border controls for a defined period in response to a major unilateral admission decision elsewhere. Schengen already permits such reimpositions in cases of public order or internal security, and they have been used. France in the aftermath of terrorist attacks, Germany in response to migratory pressure, Denmark and Sweden in various conjunctures. What is presently lacking is a clear legal basis for invoking such measures specifically in response to admission decisions elsewhere in the zone. Establishing such a basis would not constitute the dismantling of Schengen. It would constitute its rationalisation. The fourth, and most important, is financial. An automatic compensatory contribution by the initiating state, either into the EU budget or directly to neighbours who can demonstrate disproportionate consequential cost, calibrated to the scale of the admission decision. This is the mechanism most likely to provoke immediate resistance, since it would force national governments to confront the price of their generosity at the moment of granting it, rather than at some indefinite future point. That is precisely its merit. A regularisation programme that costs the initiating state nothing is one whose true continental cost is invisible. A regularisation programme that triggers automatic transfers would be costed honestly. Decisions would still be taken. They would simply be taken with their full price in view. Whether any of this is politically feasible is, of course, another matter. The Pact already represents the limit of what could be agreed under present conditions, and the agreement itself was strained, narrow, and adopted over the opposition of several member states. A Schengen discipline of the kind sketched here would require a degree of institutional honesty about the externality problem that no major European government has yet been willing to display. It would also require something even rarer, the willingness of certain member states to constrain their own future room for manoeuvre on a question that touches the deepest nerve in their national politics. Such willingness has not been notable in any direction, but the alternative is the cycle of the last decade: unilateral action, downstream resentment, populist gains, and the repeated rediscovery in each new crisis of a structural problem the architects of the Union prefer not to name. There is a subsidiary point that requires acknowledgement before this essay can move to its conclusion. because it bears directly on why a question of democratic substance can persist for a decade without resolution. The conversation about migration in Europe has, for much of the period under discussion, been narrower than the views actually held by the relevant electorates. The reasons for this narrowing are several, and not all of them sinister. Some have to do with the legitimate caution that responsible commentators bring to a subject where careless words can do real harm. Some have to do with a genuine difficulty of distinguishing reasonable policy concern from prejudice, a distinction that even careful people sometimes get wrong. Some have to do with the rise of social media, which has changed the incentives of public speech in ways nobody fully understands. Furthermore, a notable divergence has emerged between the focus of mainstream administrative discourse and the broader public sentiment regarding migration policy. This gap is not necessarily the result of a deliberate effort to exclude certain views, but rather a reflection of the differing priorities held by various segments of society. When a significant policy perspective feels underrepresented in formal forums, it may find expression through alternative channels, such as sudden electoral shifts or the rise of new political movements. This underscores the importance of maintaining an inclusive and transparent public dialogue on sensitive policy matters. The central challenge lies in the perception that decisions regarding the demographic and social composition of a community are often managed as administrative procedures rather than through broad democratic engagement. For a self-governing people, the ability to define the framework for admitting new members is a foundational aspect of long-term social cohesion and national planning. The current gap between administrative processes and public consent represents a significant political reality that requires a balanced and thoughtful resolution. The first three reasons are matters of judgment on which reasonable people may differ. The fourth has produced a measurable gap between what voters tell anonymous pollsters and what their political class permits itself to say in their name. None of this is an argument for the abandonment of standards in public conversation, nor for the toleration of speech that does genuine harm. The laws against incitement and harassment that exist across European democracies are not absurd, and the difficulty of drawing lines is real. It is rather an argument that, on this particular question, the line has at times been drawn in ways that have treated ordinary policy disagreement as if it were something more sinister. Treating a concern about admission procedures as if it were a concern about admitted people is not just analytically imprecise. It systematically delegitimizes a political position held by a substantial part of every European electorate. And when an opinion is delegitimized in respectable forums, it does not disappear. It migrates. It finds expression in less measured channels, in less responsible voices, in less constructive forms. Referendums, insurgent parties, sudden electoral landslides. None of this is mysterious. It is the foreseeable consequence of failing, year after year, to grant an honest hearing to a sincerely held view. It is worth, in this connection, noticing one further pattern. The figures who emerge as the public spokesman for these concerns are very rarely the ones a sympathetic observer would have wished. They are often abrasive where the question requires precision, combative where it requires care, and apt to make the case in language that confirms, in the mind of any sympathetic listener, the worst suspicions of their opponents. This is not a coincidence. When the conventional figures of a political class decline to take up a question, the question is taken up by less conventional figures. One may regret the result. One may not, in good faith, blame the result on those who came late to the conversation. The opportunity belonged to those who could have addressed it on civilized terms, and was not taken. It is fashionable in much of the British commentariat to regard the choice that Britain made in 2016 as a costly mistake. The economic consequences have been less catastrophic than the more apocalyptic predictions of the time, but they have not been negligible. Trade frictions, regulatory divergence, the loss of certain single market efficiencies, the irritations of new bureaucracy at Dover, all of these are real, and to pretend otherwise is to do no favours to the case for the choice. There has been a price. There was always going to be a price. Anyone who suggested in 2016 that there would not be was either misleading the public or had not given the matter much thought. But the question of whether the price was worth paying cannot be answered by reference to the price alone. It must be answered by reference also to what was bought and to what alternative was being declined. What was being declined 10 years ago was a place in a borderless internal market whose external admission policies were determined by 26 other governments accountable to 26 other electorates, none of whom answered to British voters. Britain did not leave Schengen because Britain had never joined Schengen, but Britain did leave the EU, and in so doing it reclaimed, at considerable economic cost, the formal capacity to set its own external policy on migration, asylum, and admission, without reference to the actions of any other government. Whether subsequent British governments have used that capacity wisely is frankly a separate question. They have not, by any honest measure, succeeded in reducing net migration to anything resembling the figures the public was led to expect. Various recent administrations have presided over arrival numbers higher than at any point in British history. But this is a failure of British politics, not a failure of the choice itself. The choice secured the power to decide. What was done with the power thereafter is the responsibility of those who held it. The democratic argument was always about agency, not about outcomes. Agency Britain now has. Outcomes Britain must produce for itself. From the standpoint of an observer of European politics, however, the more interesting question is what the continent makes of Britain's exit 10 years on. The polite answer, in Brussels and in most European capitals, remains that nothing of consequence was demonstrated by the British vote, that the United Kingdom paid a price for its anomaly, and that the European project has moved on without it. The honest answer is more complicated. The European project has indeed moved on, but it has moved on in a direction that, in matters of migration at least, looks rather more British than it cares to admit. Flexible solidarity instead of compulsory relocation, hardened external borders, faster returns, a general retreat from the open-handed posture of 2015. None of this is Brexit. All of it is what Brexit said. The argument was made. The argument was rejected. The argument has, in substance, been quietly absorbed. There is a deeper question beneath all this, and it is one that the technical language of the Pact and the soothing language of the Commission tend to obscure. It is the question of what a self-governing people is entitled to decide for itself, and on what terms. The European Union was built, in the years after 1945, by men and women who had lived through the catastrophe of unrestrained nationalism, and who concluded with reason that the way to prevent its repetition was to bind the nations of Europe together in a thick web of shared institutions, shared rules, and shared destiny. That project was and remains one of the great achievements of post-war politics. It would be a foolish observer who failed to acknowledge it. Yet the same project rests, in its current form, on a fiction that has become harder to sustain. The fiction is that decisions about who joins a political community, the most fundamental decision any self-governing people takes about its own future, can be treated as a matter of administrative procedure rather than democratic deliberation. Edmund Burke, who understood politics better than most, observed that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. By the same token, a political community that cannot determine, by its own settled processes, the terms on which it admits new members has ceased, in any meaningful sense, to govern itself on a question that materially shapes its future. The European Union, in its institutional language, treats this question as one of administration, capacity, and labour market fit. The voters of Europe, by an unmistakable cumulative signal across a decade of national elections, regard it as more than that. The gap between the two, between procedure and democratic consent, is the political reality of the present moment. None of this requires hostility to migrants or to migration. The economic and humanitarian arguments for substantial inward movement, particularly in a continent of declining birth rates, are serious and command serious adherence. Many of the policies under discussion in this essay, including the Spanish regularisation programme, have a real case in their favour, and the people they affect have, in most instances, contributed meaningfully to the societies in which they have settled. The argument here is not against immigration. It is for the proposition that decisions of such weight ought to be taken with the knowledge and consent of those whose lives they reshape, and that the institutions of the European Union, as presently constituted, do not adequately ensure that this happens. To say so is not to be Eurosceptic in the sloganeering sense. It is to take Europe seriously enough to want its institutions to match the seriousness of the matters they pretend to govern. 10 years ago, Britain decided that the gap between continental ambition and continental governance had grown too wide to remain inside. Reasonable people may regard that decision as right or as wrong. What no one should still be permitted to do is regard the underlying question as somehow settled by Britain's exit. It was not settled. The Spanish decree of January 2026 confirms that it was not settled. The flexible solidarity compromise in the new pact confirms that it was not settled. The Hungarian election result, in which the most prominent critic of the EU's migration architecture was turned out by his own voters, even as his critique was vindicated in Brussels, confirms that it was not settled. The question is unfinished business. The European Union has not finished it. The European Union shows few signs 10 years on of preparing to finish it. This is a serious matter and it deserves a serious response. Until the institutions of the Union find a way to discipline the externalities that its own design generates, until decisions of continental scale are taken under continental procedures rather than national fiat, the cycle of unilateral action, downstream resentment, and political fragmentation will continue. The forms it takes will vary, the substance will recur, and periodically, in one member state or another, the voters will reach for whatever instrument lies to hand to express, with whatever degree of inarticulacy, the demand that someone, somewhere, account to them for the shape of the community whose laws they obey and whose taxes they pay. Britain reached for the referendum. France may reach for something else. Germany has already, in its parliamentary politics, reached for a great deal. The pattern is recognizable. The remedy is not in sight. The candle Britain lit 10 years ago has not, in the end, gone out. It illuminated a structural problem that the European Union has spent a decade pretending was a misunderstanding. That problem is now visible to anyone willing to look at it, and it is visible most clearly in those member states whose governments, whatever the motives one ascribes to them, continue to act as though their internal borders ended at their own coastlines. They do not. Schengen does not work that way. It cannot. And until the architects of the project acknowledge that their house has, in fact, no walls of the kind they keep promising the tenants will, in their turn, continue to question whether they wish to remain inside. That is not nostalgia. It is not nationalism. It is simply the unavoidable arithmetic of a continent that has tried to share a roof without agreeing on a door. Brexit, for all its costs and all its disappointments, asked the right question. It is past time the European Union got round to answering it.